Welcome to the Ruckus Associate SmartZone Administrator demonstration series for the SmartZoneOS5 release. In this course, we'll show you the functionality of the SmartZoneOS5 along with the basic configuration of many aspects of the controller. SmartZoneOS5 is the network controller operating system that is available on the SmartZone 100 and SmartZone 300 hardware platforms, and, as we'll be discussing here, the Virtual SmartZone Network Function Virtualization or NFV platform. Here are the objectives for this demonstration. During the presentation, I'm going to discuss the system requirements for Virtual SmartZone, primarily focusing on the available platforms that it can be installed on. I'll show you how to install the Virtual SmartZone network controller on a VMware ESXi hypervisor. And finally, I'll walk you through the initial configuration of a Virtual SmartZone network controller using the Setup Wizard. Before we get started, let's take a look at the environments where the Virtual Network Controller can be installed. The Virtual SmartZone network controller can be installed on several hypervisors, including VMware ESXi, Windows Hyper-V, and KVM on CentOS. It's also available for cloud platforms, including the Google Compute Engine, Amazon Web Services, and Microsoft Azure. Each of these platforms has some specific requirements that must be met for proper operation, so be sure to review the Virtual SmartZone Getting Started Guide for Release 5 before installing, as there are several variables to factor in, including, but not limited to, the number of virtual CPUs, memory, and hard disk space. And keep in mind that these factors are based on the number of deployed devices that will be managed by the SmartZone network controller. In this demonstration, I'm going to be installing the Virtual SmartZone network controller on the VMware ESXi hypervisor platform. I'll be installing the high-scale version of the controller, but I'll be sure to show you where things change if you're installing on the Essentials edition. So I have a local instance of VMware ESXi over here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through the process of just creating the VM, the virtual machine, and then configuring some of the settings on it, powering up, and then walking through the setup wizard that we have for the SmartZone network controller. So click over here by starting with create or register VM. Now these steps are specific to VMware, but most of these other deployment options available are going to be configured in a very similar way. So these steps, while they may be a little bit different for what you're doing, will be pretty close to what we're walking through here and give you a feel for the process of how to set this up. Now, the SmartZone Virtual Network Controller comes in the form of an OVA file from support.ruckuswireless.com. So at the support website, you come over here to Software Downloads, you click the drop-down box, and you're going to want to look for the Virtual SmartZone right here. And once you click on that, it'll take you over to the Virtual SmartZone page and the different releases. And as you can see here, we have the different releases and the different formats available for the different platforms that the SmartZone Virtual Network Controller can run on. So I'm going to pick the ESXi AWS OVA image. I've already downloaded it, so I don't have to do that. Just wanted to show you where that was here. And we're going to go back over here, and we're going to select Deploy from an OVA file. Click Next. And we're just going to have to give this thing a name. VSZH demo. So this is a Virtual SmartZone. We're doing the high scale edition, and this is our demo. If you click here, it'll open up a window for you to locate your file and put it in here. I'm just going to drag it over from another window I have on my other screen, and you see here it's the VSCG-5.0.0.0.675.OVA file. This is the one I downloaded from the Ruckus support website. I'll click Next. It's going to ask me where I want to store this. The particulars of this will be unique to your environment. For me, it's very simple. I have a single data store. We'll click Next. We'll go through these. I just read all of those license agreement information. I click Agree, and it allows me to click Next. And then I get to the point where I want to decide my network mappings. Now, none of this is really going to matter to me right here in this network mappings for now. And that's because I'm going to elect to not power on automatically. The reason I do that is because when I'm running no matter what deployment, when you first deploy this VM, it's going to have 3 network interfaces. Those 3 network interfaces are for the control network, the cluster network, and the management network, which were discussed in a previous demonstration, and hopefully you viewed that before you got to this one. I'm just going to pick one of my networks. I'm going to pick the one that I'm actually going to use just for provisioning and set it up from there. Now, none of this is really going to matter right now because I have the power on automatically unchecked. And with this unchecked means this VM is not going to start the second I deploy it. So I don't want it starting because I want to have a chance to do some additional configuration to this virtual machine before I start it up. I'm going to do a thin provisioning just to save a little hard disk space on my small little local network over here. So I'm going to click Next. And we're going to move on, give me a summary. It's going to ask me, it's going to verify all the things I just configured, make sure I liked all those. I can go back and change them, but I'm going to click Finish because I'm good with what we've set up. So we're going to watch down here. This is going to deploy. Once it deploys, we're going to make a few configuration changes, and then we'll start up the virtual machine. Okay, now that that's complete, I should be able to go over here, click on Virtual Machines, and I'll see it in my list, and here it is, VSZH demo. This is the one we just created. I'll click on it, and we'll see that it is indeed powered off. I have a power on button to turn this thing on, but I don't want to do that yet. So as I said here, it's going to deploy with some defaults. It's going to deploy for me with 4 CPUs, 13 gigs of RAM, and 100 gigabytes of hard disk space. So there are requirements for you that you're going to have to consider when you're changing some of these hardware configurations. I'm going to leave them here defaults because I'm just running a demo configuration, very small, very few APs, so I don't need a lot of resources. But again, refer to the Getting Started guide for Virtual SmartZone and consider the things like how many APs you're going to deploy and manage, how many switches you might be managing, number of administrators, things like that will come into play to help you determine how many CPUs, how much memory, and how much hard disk space you have to allocate for this virtual machine. And then next you'll see I have the 3 network adapters, 1, 2, and 3. They're all assigned to that network that I picked when I first started. The way these go, they go in an order. The first one, well actually let's get into the edit screen and I'll show you from here. The first one is for your control interface. So for the control interface, you're going to want a separate network potentially for the control interface. I have different networks already defined, virtual networks in my VMware network that are on different VLANs in my switch network. So I'll pick the control network, I'll pick the cluster network. So this is the order they go in these interfaces and what they're defined to. The first one's for control, second one's for cluster, and the third one is for management. Now, for me to do my initial configuration, I'm just going to put this on my VM network so it gets a DHCP address, and then I can go and change it to the IP address I want, and then later put it in whatever network I want. So I'm going to leave it just like this for now, and I'm going to save these settings. And once these are saved, we can go ahead and power up this virtual machine. And this is going to run for a little bit, so I'm going to zoom through the next few minutes of it booting, and then I'll come back to you and we'll start taking a look at how to do the initial configuration and how we track down which IP address we need to access this device from and things like that. So I'll be back to you shortly. Okay, it looks like things are ready for us. So let's just refresh all the data on the screen and we'll take a look over here at networking. And here's where we get to see the IP address that we're going to be able to use to access the network controller through the browser interface and actually run through the setup wizard. So it was assigned an IP address of 192.168.1.56. Now, if you don't have a DHCP server, you're going to have to go through another means of setting up the IP addresses on this, and that's through the setup that comes right here through the console of the virtual machine itself. Now, we're not going to cover that in this demonstration because we've gotten an IP address and we can run through the SmartZone setup wizard. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. I plan on doing another demonstration on how to run through the setup through the console interface, running the setup command in the CLI, and walking you through how to configure IP addresses there. But look forward to that coming in another demonstration. So we can go ahead and just click on this IP address. It's going to bring it up for us. It's going to tell us it can't load. That's because we're going to need to make this secure, and we need to use port 8443. So :8443, hit return, and that'll take us to our server. Of course, we get our privacy warning because I don't have a certificate installed on it or any of those things yet, but that's okay. What this is going to come up to is our setup wizard. This is going to walk us through how we want to deploy the SmartZone network controller. Now, this is all before you get to do any configuration or any management of access points or anything else. This is just to get this controller up and operational in the form we want it to operate in. So first we need to select our language. Once we select our language, and mine is English, hopefully it comes off as English as I've spoken to in this demonstration, but we have a couple other languages that we can have presented for the web UI. This is really only for the web user interfaces and the languages that are available for it. So we'll click Next. And now we get the choice. We get the choice of high scale or essentials. So there's a few pieces that come into play on which of these you're going to choose. So high scale deployments are typically used on these large networks, such as managed service providers or MSPs, or mobile virtual network operators (MVNOs), where you can have a single instance or you can have a cluster of the SmartZone network controllers all operating and backing each other up and working together in redundant modes. They can have thousands of AP devices and 1,000 clients and supports all this clustering, and it also provides some additional segmentation because you can create domains in the high scale version that provide some management separation. So you can let someone else manage a sub portion of what's in this controller. So that's why this is great for some of those virtual network operators and managed service providers. If you select the Essentials Edition, this one's more for your enterprise, hospitality, education, businesses like that, where they're the only ones who are going to be using it, and they're a little smaller scale. That's the difference between these two. I'm going to configure high scale here just because for us it's the most complex and has the most configuration capabilities for us. And as we go through the rest of the series, you're going to see us showing some of the features of the high scale. Now the Essentials has all the same functionality. High scale just amps that up a level by some of these separations again of management and scalability. So don't worry, you'll get everything that comes into place with Essentials through these as we go through them, but we're going to select high scale here and we're going to click Next. And of course it's going to confirm, hey, once you do this, you can't go back. And this is true. Once you set this type of virtual machine as a high scale, this deployment as a high scale, you can't go back and change it to Essentials. You essentially have to deploy a new virtual machine and start this process all over again. So we'll say OK because that's what we want to do. It's going to apply that profile. And what we're going to see here is how we're going to configure the IPs for each of these interfaces on our virtual smart zone. So as you can see, we have the control, the cluster, and the management. Do we put these in hyphens here? So control is basically to manage your APs and your other devices. A cluster is a dedicated network used for clustering multiple network controllers to function together. And management is the one where you access the web interface. Now we can also support IPv4 only or IPv4 and IPv6, and in both cases really all it does is has you make sure you input information for IP version 6 and IP version 4. In our deployment here, I'm only going to do IP version 4. So I'm going to go ahead and start plugging in some IP addresses in here. Okay, there's our control IP address, our cluster IP address. We'll throw that in here real quick. And our management. So now we have all our IPs configured. We've got our management, our cluster, and our control, and then the default gateway. So this option right here is basically saying which of these interfaces do you want to use as the default gateway for this deployment. So basically, which one's going to talk out of its own network. And if you need it for multiple networks, so say we choose the management network, which is the one I'm going to pick, but you have APs that are on remote networks that are not on this 192.168.100 that we have configured for our control interface. There's some opportunities later to configure static routing. So you would have to configure some routing to be able to reach APs that are off of that network that aren't reachable through the management network. So I'm going to use the management interface as my default gateway. And then of course we got to provide some DNS servers. So I'm going to go ahead with the ones that are publicly used most of the time, and we'll go with those. And we'll click Next. Okay, so now all the changes that we've applied to the IP interfaces for the SmartZone network controller are being applied. And while they're being applied, it's going to set all these settings for the IP interfaces. And then because we've changed the IP address for the management interface to this 192.168.100.212, once it completes and right before it's about to finalize the network configuration, it's going to redirect us to this new IP address to complete the rest of the SmartZone setup wizard. So that'll come up here in just a moment. Okay, so now that it redirected me to my new IP address, we can get in here and it's going to finish loading this network information, and we can start configuring our cluster info. Now, we're going to do a new cluster, but if this were to be joining an existing cluster, you would select the Join Existing Cluster option, and it'd ask you for the information for the existing cluster. We're going to do a new cluster here, and this is really just a standalone box, so I'm just going to create a cluster just for this deployment, but that's okay. So this will just be, I like to use very simple names. This is the VSZH cluster. Uh, Give it a controller name, VSZH01, and if I tab down to the description, it's just going to populate with the controller name. You can put in more information here. We can do first controller in the SmartZone demo. So I'm in the US, so whatever country code you're in, you're going to want to select the appropriate country code. That's going to determine some of the things about, and this can be changed, but this is going to determine some of the factors about which channels are available for you to use for APs and things like that. So it's going to really make some differences in what some of the default parameters are for how things are deployed in this network. So just good useful information. And NTP server. So Ruckus Wireless has an NTP server available. It populates this for you automatically. You can obviously put in your own NTP server and use that as the time source for this network controller. And if you're operating behind a NAT, you can click this box and it'll have you put in the control NAT IP, which is basically that outside IP of how this should look in talking to the outside world. So we're not doing that here, so I'm going to not bother with that, and we're going to click Next. Okay, now we're at the administrator section. So this is where we're going to define passwords for our admin login, which is the login to the CLI and the login to the web interface. And then there's an enable password in the CLI to allow you to make changes within the CLI and using the enable login and then providing the password. So we're going to set up both of those passwords right here real quick. So set those up, made sure they match, and we're good to go. We can click Next, and once we're done with that, we can go ahead and click Finish. So this takes a little while. It's going to run for a little bit. It's going to start building everything in the virtual machine. It's going to start all the processes that are required for running the virtual machine, all the processes required for the network controller to be able to do multiple things, including manage all the APs, present the web page to you, the web interface, a lot of different functionality going on here. So this could take up to about 20 minutes. I'm going to speed through it for us so that we don't have to wait around for the whole thing, and you'll hear from me again in just a few seconds. Okay, well, it looks like our configuration is complete. The system is completely built, and it provides a link that you can just click on. It'll take you immediately to it to begin configuring the SmartZone system. I'll just click on this link, but I'm not going to get into how we configure. That's a conversation for another demonstration, and that'll be coming up next in this series. So come back for the next demonstration in the series where we'll talk about how to do initial setup of the SmartZone network controller and get it all set up to begin managing devices in your wireless network. So this concludes this presentation of the Ruckus Associate SmartZone Administrator demonstration series for SmartZoneOS5. This presentation covered the initial setup of a SmartZone virtual network controller on VMware ESXi. While it can be installed on multiple platforms, we showed you one instance, but things are going to be pretty similar in whatever platform you decide to install this, with some definite clear caveats in the cloud instances where there are some other rules you're going to have to follow for your deployment. But many of the aspects of that are the same, and we covered how to configure that instance, how to run through the setup wizard that's provided by the SmartZone Network Controller that allows you to determine the controller type, whether high scale or essentials, configure IP addresses, configure management interfaces and administrative passwords, and then once there, it deployed, and we saw that come all the way through to completion. It's somewhat of a lengthy process of waiting for it to deploy and go through all the motions of building the system out, but once that's done, it presents us quickly with a login directly into the controller, and once we're there, we can start doing management functions within this controller, including setting up more administration functionality, configuring access points, which we'll be covering in future demonstrations. So hopefully this presentation was helpful for you, and hopefully you'll come back for the next demonstration in this series. Thank you.